Eduard Richardson walked alone through the grand hall of his mansion, his footsteps silent on the polished marble floors. His mind swirled with thoughts, fragments of memories and emotions he could never quite piece together. For years, Eduard had lived in self-imposed isolation, shutting out the world. He was a man of contradictions, outwardly powerful, commanding respect and fear in the business world, but inwardly fragile, deeply mistrustful, and haunted by things he could neither forget nor confront. Silence had been his most loyal companion, the stillness of his home mirroring the void within him. Until tonight. Tonight, the silence shattered in the most unexpected way. Eduard stood in the shadow of the doorway, his gaze locked on Helena Morris, his housekeeper, someone he had rarely noticed beyond the tasks she performed with clinical precision. She was disciplined, efficient, and polite to the point of invisibility. That was all she had ever been. Or so he thought. But here she was, moving gracefully in the open space of the hall, her bare feet gliding across the floor, her body swaying with a familiarity that struck Eduard in the chest like a blow he didn't see coming. She was dancing. Not just dancing, but performing a choreography that Eduard recognized immediately, every step and turn unfolding with uncanny precision. His breath caught. This dance was theirs. It was the dance Clara had created for him, for the two of them. An intimate rhythm, an unspoken language shared only between them. Eduard's mind reeled as he watched Helena spin, her arms lifting with the same fluidity Clara had possessed, her footwork delicate but exact, like she was tracing the invisible lines of memories Eduard had buried long ago. His heart pounded painfully. How could Helena, a woman who was supposed to be a stranger, know something so personal? He leaned further into the shadows, afraid of making a sound, afraid that if she saw him, the fragile moment would break. But he couldn't stop watching. There was something almost haunting in the way Helena danced, not just familiarity, but something deeper, like an echo of a life he thought had ended when Clara disappeared. Eduard's mind raced. Could it be her? No. Clara was gone. He had spent years trying to accept that, convincing himself she was lost forever. Helena had come into his life only a few years ago, with no history, no connections. But the way she danced. His throat tightened. Helena slowed her movements, lost in the music that only she could hear. She twirled one final time and let herself fall into a stillness, her arms folding over her chest, breathing softly, as if she carried the weight of the past within her. Eduard's chest ached as he stepped back, slipping away before she noticed him. He needed answers. But how? Eduard wasn't a man who pried into personal matters. Invasiveness went against everything he stood for. Yet something was deeply wrong here, something that made him feel both exhilarated and uneasy. There were questions that demanded answers. Eduard found Daniel Lynch, his trusted lawyer and longtime friend, in the study later that night. Daniel looked up from a document, sensing the tension radiating from Eduard before a word was spoken. "What is it?" Daniel asked, closing the file and giving Eduard his full attention. Eduard hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to sharing personal matters, not even with Daniel. But this was different. "I need your help," Eduard admitted quietly, the weight of his words palpable. Daniel raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "That's a sentence I don't hear from you very often." Eduard paced the room for a moment before stopping by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. His voice was low, controlled, but there was a trace of unease in it. "Something happened tonight. I saw Helena dancing." Daniel frowned, clearly unsure where this was going. "I assume she's allowed to dance?" Eduard shook his head sharply. It wasn't just any dance. He turned, locking eyes with Daniel. It was Clara's. Daniel's expression shifted from mild amusement to genuine curiosity. "Clara." Eduard gave a tight nod, struggling to put the confusion into words. Every step, every movement. It was exactly the same as Clara's choreography. I recognized it immediately. No one else could know that dance. Daniel rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "And you're sure Helena has no connection to Clara?" "I don't know what to think," Eduard admitted, his voice strained. "But something isn't right." Daniel leaned forward. "You think Helena might be Clara?" Eduard exhaled heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "That doesn't make sense. Clara, she's gone. I know that. But the way Helena moved," he trailed off, lost in thought. Daniel studied his friend carefully, choosing his next words with care. "If you want to know the truth, you'll have to ask Helena directly." Eduard shook his head. "No. I can't confront her. Not yet. So what's the plan? Eduard's gaze hardened. I need someone discreet. Someone who can look into her background without raising suspicion. Daniel gave a slow nod, already understanding where this was going. Sarah Coleman. She's good at this kind of thing. Call her, Eduard said simply. I want to know everything about Helena Morris. No matter how far back it goes. As Daniel made arrangements to contact Sarah Coleman, another problem surfaced. Thomas Bale, Eduard's longtime rival in business, had reached out earlier that day with an unexpected proposal. He wanted to renegotiate an old contract, offering what seemed like a mutually beneficial deal. But Eduard knew better than to trust Bale. Eduard sat at his desk, flipping through the proposal with a grim expression. The terms were designed to lure him into a false sense of security, granting Bale access to a portion of his assets. It was a clever maneuver, but Eduard could see the trap buried beneath the surface. Daniel returned to the room, noticing the folder on Eduard's desk. Bale again. Eduard gave a curt nod. He's circling, looking for a way in. I'll need you to keep him off my back for now. Daniel smirked. He'll try to send Charles Green after you next. Green's desperate to broker a deal between you two. Let him try, Eduard muttered, his jaw tightening. I'm not in the mood to play Bale's games right now. And Helena? Daniel asked carefully. Eduard stared at the wall, lost in thought. I need to know who she really is, Daniel. And why she knows things she shouldn't. The lawyer gave a slow, understanding nod. I'll handle Bale. You focus on Helena. Eduard nodded, though his mind remained clouded with questions. Helena's dance had awakened something in him, not just old memories, but emotions he thought were buried for good. Now more than ever, he needed clarity. And he knew that clarity wouldn't come easily. The pieces were in motion now, Sarah Coleman on her way to uncover Helena's secrets, Thomas Bale lurking in the background with his schemes, and Eduard caught between the past and the present, between the man he once was and the man he had become. A storm was brewing, not in the sky, but within Eduard himself. And he wasn't sure which would unravel first, the truth about Helena or the fragile control he had over his own emotions. A week after Eduard's decision, Sarah Coleman arrived at the mansion. Eduard met her in his study, where the walls were lined with dark wood shelves, filled with books Eduard hadn't touched in years. The only light came from a desk lamp, casting long shadows across the room, the perfect setting for the kind of conversation that required secrecy. Eduard stood behind his desk, arms crossed. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but Sarah had dealt with people like him before. Rich men who kept their emotions locked behind iron walls, only calling for her when something important slipped out of their control. She knew how to play her role, respectful, thorough, and above all, discreet. He gestured for her to sit, but remained standing, his posture tense. I need you to find out who Helena Morris really is, Eduard said, his tone measured. He paused, then added quietly, but do it carefully. I don't want her to know she's being investigated. Sarah sat back in the leather chair, crossing her legs, her sharp eyes locked on Eduard. There was something in his voice she couldn't quite place, a hesitation, almost as if he were afraid of what she might uncover. This doesn't sound like simple curiosity, she observed, her voice smooth but probing. You already suspect something, don't you? Eduard's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting briefly to the window behind her, where the vast estate stretched endlessly beyond the glass. He hated being questioned, but Sarah's bluntness was part of what made her good at what she did. It doesn't matter what I think, Eduard said. Just do your job. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. He's rattled, she thought. Fair enough, she said. I'll be discreet. But if there's something specific I should be looking for. There isn't, Eduard interrupted sharply. Then, softening just a fraction, he added, just find the truth. Sarah nodded, understanding the boundaries he was setting. Understood. As Eduard dismissed her, she rose to leave but paused at the door, glancing back at him. Whatever it is you think she's hiding, are you sure you want to know? Eduard's face remained expressionless. I need to know. While Sarah began her investigation, Helena continued her daily routines as if nothing had changed. She cleaned the rooms with the same quiet efficiency, prepared meals without needing to be asked, and handled household matters with an unshakable calm. There was nothing in her behavior to suggest that she carried any dark secrets, nothing to indicate she was anyone other than Helena Morris, the housekeeper who had lived in the mansion for years, never drawing attention to herself. But Sarah knew better than to trust appearances. In the days that followed, Sarah's inquiries began turning up unexpected results, or rather, the absence of results. She combed through public records, background checks, and online databases, looking for anything that could give her insight into Helena's past. Nothing. Helena Morris seemed to have materialized out of thin air only a few years ago. No birth certificate, no medical records, no school transcripts, not even a trace of previous employment before Eduard hired her. It was as if she had stepped into existence just before arriving at the mansion. Sarah stared at the empty search results on her laptop, her brow furrowing. Nobody lives without leaving a trail. It was odd. Suspicious, even. People usually leave behind traces of their lives, however carefully they try to erase them. Yet, with Helena, there was nothing. What the hell are you hiding? Sarah whispered to herself, tapping her fingers against the desk. Her instincts told her this wasn't just a case of someone trying to start over with a clean slate. It was too deliberate, too controlled. And that only meant one thing: Helena had something to hide, something big. The following morning, Sarah decided to try a more direct approach. She found Helena in the kitchen, wiping down the counters with practiced ease. "Helena, right?" Sarah said, offering a friendly smile as she leaned casually against the doorway. Helena looked up, her expression polite but distant. "Yes. Can I help you with something?" "Just getting familiar with the place. I'm Sarah, a consultant. Mr. Richardson brought me in for a project." Helena gave a slight nod, her hands still moving efficiently over the countertop. "A project, is it?" "Something like that," Sarah replied with a shrug. She studied Helena carefully, noting the calmness in her movements, the way she kept her answers short but not suspiciously so. "You've been working here for a while, haven't you?" Sarah asked, her tone light, as if making small talk. Helena paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Sarah to notice. "A few years," she said, resuming her cleaning. "You must know Eduard pretty well by now," Sarah continued, watching Helena's reaction closely. Helena's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Mr. Richardson isn't an easy man to know." Sarah chuckled. "That's what I've heard." She leaned forward slightly. "And you? How did you end up here?" For the first time, Helena's hands faltered. It was subtle, a flicker of hesitation in her movements, a brief tightening of her jaw. "It's a long story," Helena said softly, avoiding Sarah's gaze. "I've got time," Sarah said, her smile unwavering. Helena met her eyes then, and for a moment, there was something unspoken between them, a quiet tension, as if they were both aware that more was being said beneath the surface of their words. But before Helena could respond, the door to the study opened, and Eduard's voice called out from down the hall. "Sarah." A word. Sarah gave Helena a quick smile. "I'll catch up with you later." Helena simply nodded, her expression unreadable as Sarah left the kitchen. Back in the study, Eduard's frustration was beginning to show. He paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. "You've been here a few days," he said as Sarah entered, his voice tight with impatience. "Do you have anything yet?" Sarah closed the door behind her and crossed her arms. "Helena Morris doesn't exist." Eduard stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "There's no record of her. No background, no history. It's like she appeared out of nowhere a few years ago." Eduard exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "That's impossible." Sarah shrugged. "I thought so too. But whoever she was before Helena Morris, she's made sure to erase every trace of that life." Eduard leaned heavily against his desk, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "She's hiding something," he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "The question is, what? And why?" Sarah added. Eduard looked up, his eyes dark with unresolved emotions. "I need answers, Sarah. And I need them soon." Sarah gave him a reassuring nod. "I'll keep digging. But whatever this is, it's not simple." Eduard stared out the window, his mind racing. Helena's dance, her secrecy, the absence of any traceable past, it all pointed to something deeper, something personal. And he couldn't shake the feeling that, whatever truth Sarah uncovered, it would change everything. The following week, Thomas Bale made his first move. Bale was not a man who liked to wait. He was sharp, aggressive, and relentless, always circling his prey with the precision of a predator. And now, his target was Eduard Richardson. The meeting had been set for midday, with Charles Green acting as mediator. Green was a professional negotiator known for smoothing out conflicts between stubborn business rivals. But even he knew that navigating the tension between Eduard and Thomas was a near impossible task. They weren't just rivals, they were adversaries in a long-standing Cold War. Eduard sat at the head of the table in the conference room at his mansion, his expression a stone mask. Thomas sat across from him, his smirk barely concealed beneath an air of fake camaraderie. Charles sat between them, looking like a man who already regretted accepting the job. Thomas opened the meeting with a broad smile, his words dripping with false charm. Eduard, you know as well as I do that the market's shifting. We need to adapt if we want to stay ahead. I've got an idea that could benefit us both. Eduard didn't even blink. I'm listening. Thomas leaned back in his chair, confident. We merge operations in key markets, a strategic alliance. I give you access to my suppliers in exchange for a minority stake in Richardson Holdings. Eduard's gaze didn't waver. And by minority stake, you mean what exactly? Thomas's smile widened. 30%. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the storm brewing. Eduard's voice was ice. Not interested. Come on, Eduard, Thomas said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. We both know the competition is getting fiercer. I'm offering a partnership that benefits us both. This is how smart men stay ahead. 30% of my company, Eduard said slowly, for access to suppliers I don't need. He leaned forward slightly, his cold gaze pinning Thomas to his seat. What's the real angle here, Bale? Thomas's grin faltered, but only for a second. He leaned in as well, dropping the pretense. You know how this works, Eduard. It's only a matter of time before your company becomes a target. You won't survive it alone. Eduard's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear, but recognition. He knew exactly what Thomas was trying to do. I'll survive, Eduard said, his voice low and dangerous. And you won't get a piece of what's mine. Charles cleared his throat, attempting to steer the conversation back to safer waters. Gentlemen, there's no need for hostility. We can. Eduard cut him off without even looking at him. The meeting is over. Thomas chuckled, standing slowly from his chair. You always were stubborn. But I'll be around when you change your mind. He paused at the door, throwing a final glance over his shoulder. And you will change your mind, Eduard. Sooner than you think. Eduard didn't respond, his gaze steady as he watched Thomas leave. That evening, Eduard sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey. His mind was still on Bale's proposal, though not because he was tempted by it. No, Bale's offer was just another move in a larger game. Eduard knew the kind of man Thomas was, patient, calculating, and always 3 steps ahead. This wasn't over. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his phone. He glanced at the screen. Rachel Wood. For a moment, he considered ignoring the call. But curiosity got the better of him, and he answered. Rachel. Her voice came through the line, warm and familiar. Eduard. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. What do you want? Rachel laughed softly, the sound laced with amusement. Always so direct. Can't an old friend call just to check in? You've never been the type to just check in, Eduard said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. What's this about, Rachel? There was a pause on the other end, and when Rachel spoke again, her tone was different, more deliberate. I heard about Helena. Eduard's grip on the glass tightened. What about her? I have to admit, Rachel said, I find it interesting. Interesting how? Eduard's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it now. You've had dozens of staff come and go over the years, Rachel said. But this one, you've kept her close, haven't you? Eduard didn't respond right away, his mind working through the layers of her words. Rachel was always careful with her phrasing, always leaving just enough unsaid to keep people guessing. Get to the point, Rachel. She smiled through the phone, and Eduard could almost see the way her lips curled at the edges. Are you sure she's just a housekeeper? Eduard's jaw tightened. Do you know something I don't? Maybe, Rachel said, her voice light but teasing. Or maybe I just like watching you squirm. Eduard exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. Rachel, if you have something to say, say it. There was another pause, and when Rachel spoke again, Her tone was softer, almost reflective. "You always did have a blind spot for the things that mattered most." Eduard frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You'll figure it out," Rachel said, and then, as if on a whim, she added, "I just want to see how far you'll go on your own." Before Eduard could respond, the line went dead. Eduard sat in silence for a long time after the call ended, the whiskey untouched in his hand. Rachel's words gnawed at him, stirring old memories and unanswered questions. She knew something, he was certain of it. But Rachel never gave anything away for free. She enjoyed playing games too much. And then there was Helena. The way she danced. The way she carried herself, always calm, always composed. And now Rachel's cryptic warning, suggesting there was more to Helena than met the eye. Eduard set the glass down with a soft clink, his mind spinning. He was no stranger to manipulation. He had spent his entire life navigating the schemes of men like Bale and women like Rachel. But Helena was different. She didn't fit into any of the familiar patterns. He had hired Sarah Coleman to find answers, but the truth was, Eduard wasn't sure if he was ready for what those answers might reveal. For the first time in years, Eduard felt something he wasn't used to: uncertainty. A few days after her initial investigation, Sarah Coleman returned to the mansion, her expression tense. Eduard could see the shift in her demeanor the moment she walked into his study. Whatever she had found, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't good. "What do you have?" Eduard asked, closing the book he hadn't really been reading. His voice was low, steady, but there was an undercurrent of tension he couldn't hide. Sarah dropped a thin file onto his desk. "Her name isn't Helena Morris." Eduard's heart skipped a beat, though his expression remained unreadable. "Go on." Sarah sat down across from him, clasping her hands. "Her real name is Elena Marquez. She was a dancer, not just any dancer, but a rising star. She performed in Europe, was featured in national productions. And then 5 years ago, she disappeared." Eduard leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. "Disappeared how?" "There was an accident," Sarah said. "The reports are vague, but according to the records, she was presumed dead." Eduard's chest tightened, his pulse quickening. He already knew where this was going, but he needed to hear it from Sarah. "And Clara?" Sarah held his gaze for a moment, letting the weight of her next words sink in. "Clara vanished the same year. There's no official connection between Elena and Clara, but the timing, it's too coincidental to ignore." Eduard's mind raced, memories flooding back with startling clarity. Clara's laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she danced, the way she used to hold him close and whisper that they'd never need anyone else. And then she was gone, like a dream that dissolved the moment he woke up. Now here was Sarah telling him that Helena, had emerged from the shadows at the same time Clara vanished. The connection between them wasn't just coincidental. It couldn't be. "She's hiding something," Eduard whispered, more to himself than to Sarah. His mind buzzed with fragments of memories and possibilities, all colliding into a tangled web of emotions. "I think you're right," Sarah said quietly. "But maybe she has her reasons." Eduard clenched his jaw, his thoughts shifting between anger, confusion, and something far more dangerous: hope. He had buried Clara's memory deep within himself, convinced she was lost forever. But now, a flicker of possibility stirred in him, threatening to undo everything he thought he knew. "I need to know," Eduard said, his voice low but resolute. Sarah gave him a long, measured look. "Just be careful, Eduard. If she's been living under a different name all these years, there's a reason for it. Whatever you find, it might not be the truth you want." "I don't care," Eduard said flatly. "I need the truth. Whatever it is." In the days that followed, Eduard's behavior toward Helena began to change. He didn't confront her directly, not yet. Instead, he started paying closer attention, studying her in ways he hadn't before. He watched how she moved through the house, graceful even when performing mundane tasks. He noticed the subtle elegance in the way she carried herself, the way her hands glided when she dusted the shelves or adjusted a vase. And there were other things too, small gestures that triggered memories he thought he had forgotten. The way she tilted her head when she listened. The faint, familiar hum she gave when she thought no one was around. The way her fingers danced absent-mindedly against her thigh when she was lost in thought. Eduard knew those habits. He had seen them before. Clara. Each time Helena smiled at him, polite but distant, Eduard felt the shadows of the past drawing closer. Was this really Clara, hiding behind a different name? And if it was, why had she left? Why had she come back under a new identity, pretending to be someone else? He found himself lingering near her more often, starting conversations that seemed casual on the surface but were loaded with hidden intent. "You've been with me for a long time now," Eduard remarked one afternoon as Helena dusted a bookshelf. "You must know this house better than I do by now." Helena smiled softly, her eyes focused on the task at hand. "It's just a job, Mr. Richardson." "Is it?" Eduard said, his gaze steady on her. "You seem comfortable here." Helena paused for a split second, just long enough for Eduard to catch it. But she quickly recovered, giving him a small, polite smile. "I like the quiet." Eduard studied her carefully, searching for cracks in the mask she wore. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when he saw something familiar in her eyes. A flicker of recognition. A trace of the woman he had loved. But Helena was careful. Too careful. One evening, Eduard found Helena standing in the grand hall again. She wasn't dancing this time, but her posture was relaxed, as if she belonged there. She gazed out over the empty space, lost in thought. Eduard approached quietly, his footsteps deliberate but soft. When he was close enough, he spoke. "Helena." She turned slowly, her expression neutral. "Yes." Eduard held her gaze, and for a moment, it felt as though time had folded in on itself, pulling the past into the present. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. Helena blinked, her expression carefully controlled. "I told you. I'm your housekeeper." Eduard took a step closer, his gaze sharp. "No. That's not the whole truth." For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or recognition. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but Eduard had seen it. "What do you want from me?" Helena whispered, her voice unusually soft. "I want the truth," Eduard said, his voice steady but intense. "I think you owe me that much." Helena's breath hitched slightly, but she didn't look away. "Some truths," she said quietly, "are better left buried." Eduard's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. "Not this one." Helena held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded, as if she had known this moment would come, but had hoped to avoid it just a little longer. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "We'll talk tomorrow." Eduard's jaw tightened, but he gave a single nod. "Tomorrow," he repeated, his voice a quiet promise. Helena gave him one last look, a look that held something Eduard couldn't quite decipher, and then turned, walking away down the hall. Eduard stood there for a long time after she left, the weight of the coming conversation pressing heavily on him. Whatever secrets Helena had been hiding, whatever truth she carried with her, it was finally within reach. Eduard knew he couldn't wait any longer. The weight of unanswered questions had grown too heavy to bear. The truth had been circling them for days, hovering just out of reach, but now it was time to bring it to light. He found her where he expected, in the grand hall, dancing once again, lost in the same quiet rhythm. The elegance of her movements stirred something deep within him. She moved as if she carried the memories of 2 lifetimes, gliding through the space like someone trying to escape the weight of her own existence. Eduard stepped into the room. "Helena." She didn't stop. If she had heard him, she gave no indication. But Eduard didn't back away this time. "We can't keep pretending," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "You need to tell me who you really are." At that, Helena froze mid-step. Her shoulders tensed as though bracing for a blow. Slowly, she turned toward him, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a moment, Eduard thought she might run, like a deer caught in the gaze of a hunter. But instead she exhaled long and heavy, as if releasing a burden she had carried for far too long. "I'm Elena," she whispered. But at the same time, "I'm not." Eduard's heart pounded in his chest, a tangled mix of hope, confusion, and pain swirling inside him. He took a step closer, his voice low, careful. "And Clara?" Helena's lips trembled, her gaze flickering with a sadness so deep it nearly broke him. "I was Clara," she said softly. "For a while. But that part of me, she had to die." Her words hit him like a wave, the truth sharp and bittersweet. Eduard's hands clenched at his sides, emotions too complicated to name crashing over him. "Why?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you tell me?" Helena's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, though none fell. Because I didn't think you'd recognize me, she said, her voice thick with regret. I had to become someone else to survive. Clara. She couldn't stay. Not after everything. Eduard swallowed hard, his throat tight. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many questions that demanded answers. But beneath it all, one thought burned brighter than the rest. You could have come to me, he whispered. I would have helped you. Helena shook her head slowly, her expression soft with sorrow. You don't understand, she said. Back then, I wasn't just running from someone. I was running from myself. I had to leave everything behind, even you. The words cut deep, sharper than any betrayal. But alongside the hurt, Eduard felt something unexpected, a strange, quiet understanding. I searched for you, he admitted, his voice rough. For years, I thought I'd failed you. That I should have done more. Helena's breath hitched, and she looked down, her hands clasped in front of her as if trying to hold herself together. You didn't fail me, she whispered. I failed us. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. It was the kind of silence that allowed wounds to surface, raw and unfiltered, waiting to be acknowledged. After a long pause, Eduard took a step forward, closing the space between them. His heart raced, but his voice was steady. It doesn't have to end like this. Helena looked up, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? Eduard's expression softened. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to let go of the bitterness he'd carried. He extended his hand, palm up, a silent invitation. Dance with me, he said quietly. Helena blinked, startled. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse. But then slowly, tentatively, she reached out and placed her hand in his. The contact was electric, not just the touch of skin on skin, but the feeling of two souls reconnecting after years of wandering apart. Without a word, Eduard guided her back into the space where they had once shared so much joy. Helena's steps were hesitant at first, as if she feared the memories might overwhelm her. But as Eduard pulled her closer, something shifted. The dance that followed was not the same one they had performed all those years ago. This was something new, slower, gentler, infused with both sorrow and forgiveness. It wasn't about recapturing what they had lost. It was about creating something different, something that could only exist now in this moment. As they moved together, the weight of the past began to lift. The pain, the guilt, the years of separation, all of it melted away, leaving behind only the present. They danced in silence, speaking through the movement of their bodies, saying all the things words could never capture. When the dance ended, Helena rested her forehead against Eduard's, her breath warm against his skin. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken truths. It was the kind of silence that marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. Eduard pulled back slightly, his hand still holding hers. Stay, he said simply. Helena looked up at him, her expression soft but conflicted. Are you sure? She asked, her voice barely audible. Eduard nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. A faint, genuine smile tugged at Helena's lips, the first real smile Eduard had seen from her since she returned. And in that moment, he knew they had both found something they thought they had lost forever: peace. In the days that followed, Thomas Bale made his retreat, frustrated and defeated. Eduard's refusal to play his games had cost Bale the leverage he had hoped to gain. With no foothold left to exploit, he quietly withdrew, knowing he had lost this round. Meanwhile, Emily Watson, the journalist who had been watching the story unfold from a distance, published a piece that would resonate far beyond the walls of Eduard's mansion. It wasn't a story about wealth or business rivalries. It was a story about loss and redemption, about the power of second chances and the courage it takes to rebuild after everything falls apart. Eduard and Helena's journey became a symbol of hope for those who believed they were beyond saving. Eduard stood at the window of his study, watching as Helena moved gracefully through the garden below. For the first time in years, he felt no need to retreat into himself, no desire to hide from the world. He had spent so long believing that love was something fleeting, something that could be lost forever. But now he knew the truth. Some things don't disappear. They change, evolve, and return in ways you never expect. Eduard smiled to himself, a quiet contentment settling over him. Life would not be easy, it never was. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. Because now, he wasn't alone.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.